Hi, welcome everyone. I'm Max Jacobs, Director of Research and Managing Partner for North America for Edison Investment Research. Today I have Jeff Cohen, Analyst at Ladenburg Thalmann, who's focusing on innovative medical technologies, especially in the small cap space.
Thanks, Max, and good morning to everyone, and thanks to Edison for having me, and thanks to my senior associate, Destiny, for putting the slides together. So I'm at Ladenburg. I'm a medical device analyst focused on a lot of innovation in a few key areas. So we wanted to walk you through some trends and provide some information as far as what we're seeing out there in the marketplace. For those of you looking at our slides, you'll notice on slide 2 that we put together a fair amount of disclosures related to some of the companies, which I think includes all of the companies which we currently cover, which is 30 public companies, most listed and trading in the US, and a handful listing and trading abroad. So I'll get to slide 3. So as you can see, we're involved in a variety of areas in medical technology. We pointed out really probably the 6 areas which encompass most of our current coverage list. And, we like what is deemed sexy, interesting innovation in those areas. As far as market caps go, I would say, generally speaking, the average market cap of the companies we look at and cover is probably $2.5 billion, and the median is far lower, which is probably in the neighborhood of $300 million, meaning a lot of the companies that we look at are smaller in nature, with perhaps employee sizes between 30 and 100 employees in totality. I'll move on to slide 4, where you can see the firm's current coverage list, which is published on a weekly basis. There's been some significant movement on some of the market caps, coupled with a couple of the ratings recently. So I'm going to move along, and as many of you know, and I'm sure Max has informed all of you, GDP and healthcare is a significant portion of the U.S. economy and the world economy. U.S. probably sees 18% GDP spend across the board, and that's certainly not diminishing or slowing down. I think healthcare expenditure continues to accelerate in line or faster than overall growth in the United States. And you can see on our slide 5 who's paying for it, which is of interest particularly for the payers and the providers, and also all individuals. On a worldwide basis, as we know, some of you are outside the U.S., as you know, healthcare expenditures in most of the developed nations is lower certainly than the U.S. Let's call it half on average amongst the top 40 or 50 economies, as measured by a number of calculations. So keep in mind that many of these countries are far smaller in size than the U.S. So when we think about the expenditure in a smallish country of 10 or 20 million in population, it still comes back to the fact that the U.S. markets are certainly the largest market for medical devices, followed by what we call Europe, which is inclusive of the 30-ish countries, followed by Asia Pacific, followed by some other countries in particular. So I'm going to try to define what we're looking at and what we care about here. So, and what we've seen more recently being the past year or so as far as innovation. So a few areas that we want to address are the following. So firstly, we want to address energy on slide 8. So, we've had the belief for quite a while that the delivery of energy, both external and internal in the body, is far superior, more effective, with less side effects than the delivery of pharmaceuticals. And we're seeing more and more innovation around that. And I would honestly say that continues to accelerate. So as you can see, we're showing some images here, generally speaking. So, what we would like to identify is a number of areas. So firstly, TMS therapy, transmagnetic stimulation on the cranium for a number of indications. Firstly, depression, which is approved, followed by a number of indications. One of the companies has an additional approval in one indication. We're probably going to see a lot more indications. I believe there's currently around 8 companies with approved TMS devices, although worldwide there's still about 2,200 units, predominantly dominated by 2 companies, with companies number 3 and 4 having a few hundred units in totality. What we would also mention related to this space is, besides the additional indications in depression, OCD, PTSD, et cetera, we're probably going to see this technology proliferate more toward or into neuromuscular and neuromotor disorders. And specifically, we think of stroke, we think of MS, think of Parkinson's in particular, where we probably see some additional innovation in those areas. So a couple of the other companies that we're showing here are dealing with headaches and migraines, which is periodic treatment and external delivery of energy, mostly kind of fairly straightforward stimulation technology that we're seeing dealing with different labels in the headache range that are worth noting. One of the companies here is delivering energy that's dealing with ulcerations and diseases in the skin, foot ulcers, wounds in particular. And we're seeing a number of innovations around those areas. We're also seeing another company that is really interesting with a recent approval in Japan for head and neck cancer, where targeted therapy is being infused in the body on day 1, and that patient's coming back on day 2, whereby some light energy on sticks of sorts is being inserted into those specific tumors to activate the targeted therapies. And we may see some more of that from the same company and other companies as well. So that kind of gets us back to our energy first. And as far as specific types of energies, we're seeing a lot of light therapy in a number of different wavelengths. We're seeing different ultrasound, focused ultrasound, X-ray technologies, STIM technologies in a number of areas that are being studied extensively and at a commercial stage or coming to a commercial stage. I'm going to move along to slide 9, which is another area with particular interest to us, is the area really focused on proactive and predictive technologies, commonly referred to as AI by many of the people out there. And that is that there's been a real paradigm shift for, Mrs. Jones, you now have this condition, this is what we'd like to do about it, which is now moving into Mrs. Jones, based upon our data set and thousands of other samples, we believe that you may be getting the following, or you're at a higher risk to develop the following. So certain disease states and conditions can be cut off earlier, and they can also be known about better as far as the data and sets that are out there in the predictive space. So a few companies to mention. One in particular is focused on the sleep apnea space, which is highly correlated to cardiac health as well. A couple areas in genetic testing, we're seeing a tremendous amount of genetic testing and more genetic testing, which is more specific, picking up on various variations of genetic disorders with larger and larger libraries of data and information that's being collected out there. So, the traditional fish and karyotyping in the genetic space is being advanced far greater and better, more efficiently with higher throughput at lower costs going forward. We also certainly recognize the opportunity for diagnostics to utilize the molecules and molecular weight and changes there. One of the companies on that slide is working on that. And the predictive analytics in general permit healthcare providers and workers to take corrective actions earlier. Further data out there, economic data, shows that getting information earlier saves lives, saves money, saves hospital time, and saves quality of life for many patients in the marketplace. So AI is also being used in drug development that we can see there from a couple examples in AI, where it's being used earlier with the pharmaceutical industries, even in a preclinical settings prior to going into to humans. So we think that data and insights from this data are going to proliferate dramatically, and we're seeing a lot of spend into the space, into AI and genomics and genetic information. So we expect that will continue. I'm going to move along to slide 10, which is, I would call it our cool stuff slide, where we'd like to identify some really fascinating technologies that are going on out there. I'd say in the cardiology and vascular space, a total artificial heart is certainly of interest to us. One in particular has been implanted in a couple score of patients now and has a CE mark, and you'll see a lot more implants in a few Western European countries, as well as a first-in-human study in the United States that will be enrolling and implanting in 2021. Furthermore, in that various area of cardiology and vascular, one company working on a venous valve. We've all heard of valves in the cardiac setting. There are no commercial valves that are lower in the body than the abdomen, where AAAs are implanted. So a venous valve in the legs would be a major advancement for moving blood up. As my associate says, that would be akin to compression stockings for society. So what we're seeing is from diabetes and cardiovascular issues, fluid buildup, blood filled up in the lower limbs, which historically related to amputations. And now with atherectomy and the opening of the veins and arteries, blood is flowing better, and a venous valve could potentially be a big change there. So on the colorectal side, there's a number of technologies dealing with bowels and pre-bowel prep for colonoscopies, faster, quicker, more efficient. It's been actually a bit of a bottleneck in the hospital setting and very expensive for patients to be waiting to properly prep for colonoscopies with data and readouts that aren't that great from traditional colonoscopes. So we're seeing innovation in aesthetics, predominant innovation in a number of areas. Firstly, with the types of energies that are being used in aesthetics, the way they're being used, the business models that are being used to deliver them in the aesthetic market. We're also encouraged by the use of robotics in aesthetics, and we're going to be seeing some robotic technologies in the aesthetic area. We do cover a company, we're already aware of a robotic aesthetic company dealing with hair transplantation, both the explantation of hair follicles as well as the implantation on the other end, whereby hair transplants of 10 and 20,000 follicles, which historically took a team a few days, has now been turned into a robot with some assistance of staff doing this in less than a day or less than half a day. Another big area of innovation is women's health, an area we haven't heard about too much in the past, and we're seeing more and more monies being spent in commercial health, particularly in R&D pipelines as well as commercialization. We're seeing more targeted panels, time to diagnosis, treatments, and patient improvements in a number of areas, specifically birth control and hormonal imbalances. And we're seeing also some tests in a number of areas that are picking up cancers like ovarian cancers earlier and better, where the current technology on the marketplace has been around for decades. So there's a few other images here worth noting. One in particular is fluid removal with an implantable device and retraining the liver and the kidneys and the ability of the body to rid itself of excess fluid. So that's interesting. Also some interesting imaging technology, external imaging technology dealing with wounds and burns and topical type of treatment as well. So I think that covers it as far as what we're seeing interesting. And I'm going to turn it back to Max. You'll see our web and imaging sources on the last slide, but I want to thanks to Edison, and thanks to Max for having me talk about some interesting technology. So I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks, Jeff. That was great. So I was just wondering, on the GDP slides, it's really quite notable, like the difference between not just the US and other countries, but really Western and Central and Eastern Europe. So I was just wondering, is that a major opportunity for healthcare companies to expand into those countries as they, I guess, continue to advance more and maybe catch up with Western Europe?
Yeah, so specifically U.S. technologies that are proliferating in other territories, such as Europe. What I'd say is the following. Obviously, Europe is a top target for a commercial presence for anything with the CE mark that's potentially already also carrying an FDA mark. How to get to market is another story. So, what we've seen predominantly is a lot of U.S. companies not understanding, wanting, or willing to pour a lot of resources into a European commercial channel that they own. Rather, what they do is they partner with distributors in various geographies that understand the geographies and exist in those geographies. So, and you're seeing that in different fashions. You may see partners for countries or geographies specifically. So you may see a strong distribution partner in one country, like even outside of Europe, like a Singapore, or in Europe, like a Germany specifically. You may also see an arrangement with a territory. In most cases, as you know, Max, the standard commercialization, kind of model. The traditional model is, that the distributor keeps the last 20 or 30 or 40% of the transaction sale price, the ASP, or what it's being sold for. And in some cases, you're seeing arrangements for that may include upfronts, milestones, and royalties. So you may see a company doing a partnership with another large company for all of Western Europe or for all of Asia, whereby they will get an upfront payment as well as some royalties and milestones. There may also be some minimums involved in units or dollars that's commercialized, meaning that if the partner doesn't perform as they were expected to, they would have the ability to change that partner or go direct for that matter.
You mentioned how people have different distributors in different countries. I always felt like trying to sell into Europe has always been a bit of a horror show, just because of the fact that, you'll get the CE mark that allows you to sell your device, but then you have to go almost like house to house, well, country to country, trying to get reimbursement. And it seems like even some of the larger, more successful companies are really only focused on a small segment of the actual of Europe, because they just haven't been able to get whatever, Italy, Slovenia or something on board, with reimbursement. So any light at the end of that tunnel? I mean, it's supposed to be a unified kind of super state, but it's not really acting like that.
Not a whole lot of light there, Max, that I can see. So even in the US with companies that are commercial, it's an issue of the payers, the reimbursement, the data, et cetera. But Europe's been tough. Firstly, the who's paying for it is, very difficult in many countries and very many territories, partially because the economic condition in many European countries is not great. And the data may not be there as far as the benefit or the in the US, we'll see companies that are documenting that they're saving money to the payers or to the hospitals or to, benefits to the patients as well. And that data doesn't exist or is slow to exist because the companies are not putting the resources in as far as collecting the data to get that. So I think the The challenges that exist in Europe, and I'm including the UK in this discussion, are not going to change dramatically. I think, that's going to change slowly. There are some glimmers of hope, however, in some of the larger and wealthier countries. Germany is a great example, or France or the UK, that actually do want, these newer technologies to advance in a swifter fashion, are actually helping on that front. You're seeing some grants that we know of with even companies we cover. You're seeing grants out of the UK, France, and Germany to kind of advance some of these technologies because they know the benefit, or they've already seen a lot of the benefit from similar examples. Could be the same technology in the US that they want to get there faster.
Okay, great. I would continue along this subject, but I think it's of interest only to me, really. So let's move to the energy segment. And now, just in turn, I don't know if you can kind of make some sort of global statement about this, but so when you see the clinical data for these technologies, are they generally like better than the existing technologies, or is it just a non-invasive substitute that may or may not be better?
Yeah, it's a great question, Max. I think it's both at the moment. So, there's been decades of data, for example, depression, right? We know there's many, many, many drugs out there for depression, and it's been moderately efficacious for some portion of the population. However, there's a lot of the population that's not effective or is treatment resistant from pharmaceuticals. We also see people spending years and years experimenting with different medications. In the case of depression, where they're titrated up, titrated down, onto the next drug, titrated up, titrated down, onto the next drug. So it's certainly showing a lot of benefit. There's already been a fair amount of data collected in this space. So that is certainly encouraging. We're also seeing the payers recognizing this in the United States, because now you could go for TMS therapy after 2 failures on courses of therapy in the pharmaceutical space. It used to be 4 failures. So they're seeing patients, let's say, earlier in the paradigm. So and we all know, and it's been well documented, that in the past 12 months, the mental health rates are skyrocketing. And whether that's up 40% or up 4-fold remains to be seen. But, the TMS space will be seeing a lot of those patients, and it won't take 2 years. It will be swifter than that, one would think. So hopefully that answers your question. In other areas like ADHD and stimulation, MS, Parkinson's, it's still early in the data sets. So there's still fairly limited data with limited number of patients. And as you know, Max, an N of a few hundred or a few thousand by many accounts is still considered small.
Yeah, thank you for that. That was very helpful. Maybe we can dig a little deeper into, like in the depression space, there's Brainsway. Now, they had some excellent data in depression when you couple it with medical treatment versus medical treatment alone. I think they had regression rates like over 50% versus like 11% with just medical therapy. So data's there, but how does a company like that convince psychiatrists who are used to just cycling people through 6 different generic medications to suddenly say, I'm going to do this device thing with you? And then how does that actually work? Do they have to refer them to someone else to try that treatment? Just in terms of the commercialization strategy, how do you get the idea of Brainsway into people's heads, into people's realities?
No pun intended. So it's actually a great question. So with some push and some pull, as we know, there's 60,000+ psychiatrists in North America, around that number, with only 1,000 or 1,500 TMS units that exist here in totality. So the surface has not even been scratched at all. So that's coming from awareness and education, both from the clinician side and the patient side. So now patients are now asking for it. They're saying, the drugs have terrible side effects to many people that they just don't want to live with, and they would rather, an energy treatment for 17 minutes, for 30 out of 36 days may in fact correct their condition dramatically. But the clinician side is still, a lot of the industry is still very naive to technologies. Clinicians are not used, psychiatrists are not necessarily in touch with medical technology over pharmaceuticals. They may be even unaware of that. But the penetration rates and the size of this addressable market is still, it's tiny as far as penetration relative to the size of the market. So that's still very small, but it's coming both as push and pull. The patients are becoming, or people suffering with different conditions are becoming more and more aware that there are things out there that are not prescription pharmaceuticals. And the psychiatrist population is becoming more and more aware. We're seeing more centers being opened. We're seeing even companies that are focused on owning and managing the centers as well.
That's a good idea. And you mentioned reimbursement and how they're now getting reimbursement after like 2 failed treatment courses with other antidepressants. So I was just wondering though, like how would you characterize that reimbursement level? Is it, high, low, medium? Like, because what I found when I was, like, I don't know if you remember Venus Medical, the varicose vein company that had been taken out by Covidian. But I remember there was a vascular surgeon who was telling me that he was making as much money with one of those 15-minute outpatient procedures as he did 6 hours elbow deep in blood trying to fix an aneurysm. So, I'm just trying to understand, like, are these centers making money off of, is the reimbursement high enough that they're profiting from it? Or is it sort of like neutral, so they might not be excited because there's not that financial element?
I would characterize it generally as medium to high. I wouldn't say too high to offend the payers, and I wouldn't say too low to offend the physicians. But generally speaking, a patient in depression for a course of therapy on TMS is in the ballpark of around $8,000 for 30 treatments. So if you're comparing it to, generic pharmaceuticals, it may be a lot higher. If you're comparing it to branded pharmaceuticals, it may be a fair amount lower. So the codes are in place and they're continually being evaluated in the United States. But generally speaking, it's a fairly compelling argument to all of the stakeholders at current prices. So as far as the office and the use, this is 30 minutes. It might be 18 minutes of energy. It's a 30-minute visit as far as the scheduling goes, with a highly skilled technician or PA that's operating the device itself. And as far as how the money's flowing, we do see there are a few models out there. There's as what you've seen, Max, with almost all Medtech now, if you want one, fill in the blank what you want, you'll get it tomorrow. It's just a question of, how's the money flowing? Are you buying it? Are you leasing it? Are you renting it? Are you paying per click every time you use it? So there's a lot of models out there, from one end of the spectrum of I'll just buy the device and I may or may not have to buy a consumable from the company, to the other side, which is the device is free and I'm just going to pay you X dollars for every time I use it, and pretty much everything in between.
Okay, awesome. So let's just move quickly to the AI segment. AI has been used very broadly historically, and also with a lot of hype. I think people think of AI, they think of Cyberdyne Systems and Skynet and all that kind of stuff. But it seems that like the technologies you mentioned were probably more practical, kind of just evolutionary steps where AI is helping with some very specific issues, where something like AI can help. AI can't necessarily do everything, but these companies have found ways to actually make it workable. Is that like a kind of a fair assessment of the situation?
Yeah, and certainly the patients are also becoming more aware of what's out there and existing. A good example is the in the genetic space, right? We've all heard of what's going on more and more with the direct-to-consumer tests, all the way up to a 7-digit sequencer of sorts. So what from the AI side, what we're seeing is the collection of data. So Max, you go and you have a genetic test, and they find some type of strange variant. Well, it's no longer a strange variant because they're in possession of hundreds of other strange variants that are the exact same strange variant that you think you had. And then comes a discussion of what is the variant, what does it mean, how is it being expressed in others, and what can be done about it. So that's a perfect example of owning the data being more beneficial. It would be the same of a software package for robotic technology, defining a don't touch region for a procedure, whereas you define, hey, I don't want to go in this region, and actually you mark that in, and the tool won't even let you go into that region. So there's many examples of how to determine what might be existing and how to avoid it or knock it out, as well as how to define what it means and how to treat it, kind of as a big picture. So the AI is really the data collection and the lessons learned in the case of software. It would be just like in a cardiac setting. Let's say you're an interventional cardiologist and you're putting in a valve. You would want to know, if I'm taking this measurement and it's some measurement that gives me a mathematical number that's outside of the bounds, what might that mean? Well, if you had a lot of information from a lot of previous cases, you could get an answer of, hey, if the number's this number, it could mean these 3 things are happening. So then how can you, as the interventionalist, alter or change what you're doing based on the data?
But I mean, doesn't that have the potential to sort of just being like kind of a Google doctor on steroids? Like, they find all these correlations, but then like if you talk to like a real, like an actual physical doctor, they'll be like, no, that's not what's going on. So I find that like, people, if they've been doctors for like, say 20 years, they can make those leaps and have that pattern recognition capability that AI isn't necessarily at right now. Or am I mistaken?
So the idea of technology, as I've seen it over the past couple decades, is to make the clinician or physician better. The first part of that is having that clinician or physician admit that they are not omniscient as they may believe they are. So that's part of the curve as far as the knowledge. In the case of a good example would be spine, where surveying some of the best docs that exist out there a decade ago, they were perfect. However, the data suggested that 5 to 10% of all spine cases require revisions. So how could you explain that? Well, maybe Dr. Perfect doesn't see the same patient for the revision because they go elsewhere. So I think that the younger part of the population is embracing the information and the knowledge. And, we're seeing that in all areas. And that, there's now, fellows and 20s and 30s and 40-year-olds that are demanding certain technologies because they know they're out there and they know all the stakeholders are benefiting. So they want to embrace it. But I'm not disagreeing with your point, but a lot of it has just been shown to be tremendously beneficial. And you're correct in saying that, yes, some of the plays that are focused on AI and informatics and data collection aren't necessarily going to benefit the stakeholders. But, the ones that we look at are or are planning to, or we believe that they have the ability to.
Okay, great. And you made an excellent point about kind of, younger doctors more likely to embrace some of these technologies, because that just reminded me of, I was doing a lot of work into a robotics company. And every kind of elderly KOL I talked to was like, no, I would never use that. I do a perfect knee every time. Why would I use this thing? And also with setup time, I'm actually doing fewer procedures. But when I would talk to younger physicians, they would all be like, oh yeah, no, it's great. I get to do a perfect knee every time because of this technology. And it's great for advertising. People like the cutting edge end of it. And it did actually work. So that's definitely true about how things work. I do actually have a question on one thing you mentioned with regards to AI technologies was use in sleep apnea. So I was just wondering, how does that work exactly?
Yeah, so in the case of continuously measuring certain parameters on the body throughout the evening while you're sleeping is very effective in diagnosing certain conditions. As most people are aware of, many people have been to or are going to a sleep study, which requires a lot of wires and a large check for your evening stay. Most people don't like it. So that data, actually, one can get better data faster one evening at a very low cost. So the data from sleep apnea is highly related to coronary conditions and cardiac conditions. So in some cases, depending on the data, those patients would be referred to a cardiologist and may need certain medications. They may have issues with blood pressure or the rhythm at which their heart is beating and many other conditions. But a lot of cardiac conditions show up with sleep studies and vice versa.
Now, I'll ask a kind of just a general question with regards to kind of the innovator companies. What's generally the hurdle for these innovators? Is it the regulators, or is it the doctors willing to try something new? I mean, we sort of touched on that a little bit already, but where is kind of the biggest challenge for them?
Well, the biggest, to even start earlier, the biggest challenge, Max, is to be able to afford to develop the technology and to get it approved. I would say that's kind of the biggest hurdles that exist, and that applies to a CE mark or an FDA clearance or et cetera. So that's the biggest challenge. And then the challenge is the commercial activities, which is expensive to go direct and is expensive from your P&L standpoint to go indirect, which is quite costly. And then the data, whereby companies continually want to collect more data on their technology. And the data comes in the form of more studies, which are both sponsored by the companies or could be sponsored by physicians and clinicians, investigator-led studies as we define them. So the data is a huge hurdle. The commercialization is a huge hurdle. So a lot of these companies have many hurdles. Some have great experience and a pathway for which to do it. The larger companies have done this many times with many technologies. So you could take a technology from one specific area and almost bolt on the similar experience in another area for which to push that forward. However, with many new technologies, you're battling kind of a greenfield of experience. So you need to figure out where it's going and how you can get there. So that includes approvals, labels, label expansions, data, awareness, commercial activities, et cetera.
Great, that was helpful. And you mentioned fundraising. Medtech is almost like the ugly stepchild compared to their better looking sibling biotech? Just in terms of, money invested, valuations, investor interest. Why do you think that is? Because, I found Medtech to have, first of all, obviously very innovative technologies. And also in terms, like, there's a different risk profile for those companies compared to biotech. You're going to kind of know early on if it's generally doing what it's supposed to do. While in biotech, it could be complete placebo through like phase 3, and you wouldn't know. Or, so why do you think that's the dynamic?
Yeah, well, that's interesting and a very, I could go on for a while with an answer there, but I would say generally speaking that, biotech or that space has always been hugely attractive. Part of the reason is because of the perpetual money burn, which attracts Wall Street, as well as the kind of, sell the dream paradigm. So, hey, this is a $1 billion plus marketplace, and we're going to have $1 billion of revenue in X years, maybe. And that's always been an attractive model, whereas the medtech company, in the past was looked at, who cares? You're selling, a few dollars of this, but, you're not making money or burning money, so I'm going to shrug my shoulders. So that the paradigm is changing. It has been changing, and I think the rate of the changing has increased in the past year. So what we're seeing now is, investors wanting to know how big these markets can be, how fast these companies are growing, and what that may mean for their top lines and eventually their bottom lines. Most of the companies we deal with are still in growth mode and not in EPS mode. So that is changing. I would agree, particularly in the case of areas whereby medtech can knock out pharmaceuticals and biotech for many indications.
You just give an example. Are you talking about like brain sway, kind of potentially knocking out pharmaceuticals there, or is there something else?
I think in the case of depression, specifically, that area is so huge that it's just a question of, medical technology picking up some market share points in the next year or 2 or 3 or 4. It would likely still not knock out pharmaceuticals. If it was 5% of the market, then the TMS companies would be literally 10 times the size.
So what could knock out a pharmaceutical?
I mean, a lot of technologies have the ability to displace pharmaceuticals, I would say. In the case of motor disorders, MS, Parkinson's, stroke, brain disorders, mental disorders, as we just discussed, headache, migraine, specifically, and diabetes, a number of other areas where, a mechanical or equipment therapy and energy delivery can knock out pharmaceuticals or demonstrate superiority, speed to therapy, lower cost, less side effects, et cetera.
Okay, and just want to maybe finish on, like, you've been a medtech analyst for quite a while. You're highly experienced. So just what do you look for in a medtech company? Like when you see these things, or you have a very good feeling that it's going to be successful.
Yeah, I didn't mention this yet, but a lot of it comes down to leadership. So you may see, and we have seen, great technologies, but because of the lack of leadership or inexperienced leadership, we don't see those technologies get developed or get approved or get, commercial presence. So, one of the top things that we look at is who's running the company and what kind of leadership do they have. Is it someone that has done it 5 times already elsewhere, that knows how to do it in a slightly different example and is going to do it, and we believe they can? Or is it someone new to something that's not necessarily motivated or not have the same motivations and may not be able to get it done? And we often see companies where they'll spend a few years on one path, and then they will realize what we're saying, and they will change the path.
And so what kind of, like, those leaders, are they typically from, ex Abbott, Medtronic, St. Jude people who then go to smaller companies, or do they come from all over with various backgrounds?
Usually and typically, in what we look at, the folks that really stand out on the leadership front have experience and have picked that up from other types of adjacent technologies and companies. It's unusual that someone would be, jumping sectors completely from some other area of the economy to a medical technology company. And we could think of a few examples where, that person leading did great things elsewhere, and perhaps the previous company or product was acquired or changed hands, and now they're driving something new in a adjacent area, but they know how to get it done, and they know how to progress, and they know the steps that they need to take to get something, whether it's from an idea or a approved commercial product, to the next level.
Great, Jeff. That is very helpful. And thanks for joining us today. I think this was a very informative discussion.
Thanks again. Thanks, Edison, for having me. And thank you, Max. Nice to see you, and Happy New Year.
Yeah, Happy New Year.